When you picture medieval dining, what comes to mind? Probably lavish feasts in castle halls, tables stacked with roasted meats, spiced dishes, and goblets overflowing with wine. It's the kind of scene we've all seen in movies and TV shows, a romanticized image of a world long gone. But here's the truth, those feasts were rare, reserved for the elite. For nearly 90% of people living between 500 and 1500 CE, ordinary peasants working the land, mealtime wasn't about luxury or indulgence. It was about survival. So, what did they actually eat every day? How did they stay alive through harsh winters, failed crops, and endless labor? Today, we're peeling back the curtain on the real medieval diet, and it might surprise you how simple, and surprisingly smart, it really was. Imagine for a moment that you wake up in a small wooden house somewhere in rural Europe around the year 1200. There's no fridge humming in the corner, no convenience store down the road, and certainly no delivery apps promising food at your door in 20 minutes. For more than 90% of the people in the Middle Ages, life looked like this. They were farmers, laborers, people whose entire existence depended on the land right outside their doorstep. Food wasn't about flavor or enjoyment the way we think about it today. It wasn't about, what do I feel like eating tonight? It was about survival, simple, repetitive, and absolutely essential. Every meal depended on whether the crops grew well that year or whether a storm or drought had wiped them out. A bad harvest didn't mean you just eat less variety, it often meant real hunger, sometimes even famine. The average medieval farmer burned a lot of calories through physical labor, tilling fields, tending animals, hauling wood and water. That meant their bodies needed energy, anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day. But those calories didn't come from burgers, steaks, or anything we'd call high protein. Their diet was built mostly around one thing: carbohydrates. Bread, grains, and porridge were the backbone of life. This wasn't the kind of bread you might imagine today, fluffy and white and sliced evenly in a plastic bag. No, medieval bread was dense, coarse, and sometimes filled with whatever filler people could find. Rye and barley were common because wheat was often too expensive or hard to grow in many regions. Sometimes, during especially bad harvests, people stretched out what little flour they had by adding ground-up beans, chestnuts, or even tree bark to make it last longer. Imagine biting into a loaf that felt heavy and tasted earthy, not exactly a bakery treat, but it kept you alive. Meat, on the other hand, was rare for the average person. It wasn't that they didn't like meat, they loved it, but raising animals purely for eating was expensive. Chickens, cows, or pigs were worth more alive for their eggs, milk, or labor than they were as dinner. When meat did appear on a peasant's table, it was often on special occasions or in tiny amounts, like a bit of bacon in a stew, just enough to give it flavor. Spices? Almost non-existent for the lower classes. The exotic spices we think of, pepper, cinnamon, saffron, were luxury items, imported across long trade routes, and they cost a fortune. Most food was seasoned with whatever grew nearby: onions, garlic, leeks, maybe some herbs from the garden. If you've ever had plain oatmeal every day for a week, you're starting to get the picture of what life tasted like. And yet, there's something fascinating about this lifestyle. Every bite you took connected you to the land and the season. You didn't just eat, you depended on a rhythm older than memory, the cycle of planting and harvest, of storing food for winter and hoping it would last. People learned to be resourceful, stretching ingredients, fermenting or drying food so it wouldn't spoil, and creating meals designed to fill the belly even when flavor was an afterthought. The risk of hunger always hung over their heads. A single failed crop could mean weeks or months of hardship, and in some cases, entire communities faced starvation. This constant pressure shaped not only how people ate but also how they thought about life itself. Food wasn't taken for granted. It was earned, often painfully, from soil and sweat. So, when we look at medieval eating habits, it's easy to feel a bit of pity for their lack of variety and flavor. But for them, food wasn't boring, it was survival, a direct result of the environment and technology they had. Their meals might seem bland by modern standards, but they were ingenious in their own way, perfectly adapted to a world where the line between enough food and not enough food was very thin. And that's the reality of the medieval diet at its core: mostly carbs, not much meat, very few luxuries, but enough, most of the time, to keep people alive and strong enough to work another day in the fields. If there was one food that defined life for medieval people, it was bread. It wasn't just part of their diet, it was their diet. For most farmers and laborers, bread provided an incredible 70 to 80% of their daily calories. That might sound extreme, but think about it: bread was portable, filling, and relatively easy to make if you had access to grain and a bit of time. And in a world where people worked from sunrise to sunset, that dense loaf of bread was the difference between getting through the day or going to bed hungry. But don't picture the soft, airy loaves we're used to today. Medieval bread was something else entirely. It was heavy, often coarse, and sometimes a little gritty from bits of bran or even tiny stones left behind in the flour from rough grinding. Most of it was made with rye, or with a mix of rye and wheat called maslin. Wheat was expensive and hard to grow in many regions, so pure white bread, the kind the wealthy enjoyed, was rare and often seen as a luxury. For the average peasant, their loaf was darker, denser, and a bit sour, something that stuck to your ribs but didn't necessarily delight your taste buds. Bread wasn't just a food item, it was a measure of security. Having bread in the house meant your family could make it through the day. Running out of grain, on the other hand, meant panic. It's no wonder that in times of bad harvest or war, bread riots were common. People could go without meat or luxuries, but take away their bread and you had a crisis on your hands. And when grain supplies ran low, medieval people got creative. They stretched their flour with whatever they could find. Beans were ground into meal and mixed with grain, adding protein but changing the texture. Chestnuts, when available, were dried and milled into flour, giving the bread a nutty taste but making it crumbly. And yes, in truly desperate times, even tree bark was dried, ground, and added to the mix. It sounds unthinkable now, but in an age where famine was a real possibility, anything that could bulk up a loaf and keep bellies from aching was worth trying. Baking bread was also an event in itself. Most peasants didn't have private ovens because maintaining one required space, fuel, and time. Instead, many villages had a communal oven, essentially a stone or brick structure where families took turns baking. Women would knead their dough at home, then carry it to the oven on designated baking days. Imagine the scene: neighbors chatting as they waited their turn, the smell of fresh bread filling the air, and children hoping for a warm crust to snack on when the baking was done. Bread even shaped how other foods were eaten. In an age before plates were common in every household, thick slices of stale bread, called trenchers, were used as makeshift plates. A thick stew or chunk of meat, on the rare days it was available, would be placed on top of the trencher. The bread would soak up the juices, and when you finished the main course, you ate the plate as well. Nothing went to waste. There was also a hierarchy hidden in bread. Wealthy households could afford fine, white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour, while the average farmer ate the darker, coarser loaves. This distinction was so strong that bread itself became a symbol of social class. To eat white bread was to show status, while black bread became shorthand for poverty. Even so, for peasants, that rough bread kept them alive and fueled the endless physical labor of medieval life. The dependence on bread also made life risky. If grain prices rose or supplies failed, people quickly went hungry. Unlike modern times, when we can substitute one food for another, medieval peasants didn't have that flexibility. Bread was survival. This reliance pushed communities to stockpile grain, build mills, and regulate baking, all efforts to ensure that people wouldn't starve when times got tough. And yet, there's something deeply human about it all. Bread wasn't just food, it was culture, ritual, and comfort rolled into one. It was the first thing you ate in the morning and often the last thing you had at night. It was broken and shared during religious feasts, blessed by priests, and given as charity to the poor. In many ways, bread was both ordinary and sacred, a symbol of the cycle of life itself. If you close your eyes and imagine life back then, you can almost smell it, the yeasty, earthy scent of a loaf just pulled from the communal oven, steam rising into the cool morning air, and a tired farmer breaking it apart to share with his family. It might not have been glamorous, and it certainly wasn't gourmet, but in the medieval world, bread was more than food, it was survival, connection, and a promise of one more day of life in a world that could be harsh and unpredictable. If bread was the foundation of medieval life, pottage was the glue that held daily meals together. Picture it, a single pot simmering over the hearth, bubbling slowly through the day, filling the small wooden home with the warm, earthy scent of grains and vegetables. This wasn't just food, it was the kind of meal that defined an era. Pottage was humble, but it was everywhere. At its simplest, it was a thick stew, or depending on how much water you had, a thin soup, made with whatever ingredients were available at the time. Grain was usually the starting point. Barley, oats, or rye, cooked slowly until they softened and thickened, formed the base. Then came vegetables pulled from the garden or scavenged from the wild, carrots, turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage. And if the family was lucky, there might be a handful of beans or peas thrown in, adding a little protein and substance. Meat in pottage was a rare treat. A few scraps of bacon or the occasional bone might go in for flavor, but for most peasants, pottage was primarily vegetarian, more out of necessity than choice. The meat they did add was often from older animals no longer useful for breeding or labor, or from hunting small game if regulations allowed. In fact, pottage became so closely tied to the peasant experience that some wealthier families, when hosting feasts, intentionally avoided serving it, as if to say, "We don't live like that." But for ordinary families, pottage was perfect. It was practical, filling, and easy to keep warm throughout the day. The pot often stayed on the hearth from dawn to dusk, with family members ladling out a portion whenever they were hungry. Leftovers were simply topped off with more grain, water, and vegetables for the next meal. In a way, it was a living dish, constantly evolving as ingredients came and went, and it changed with the seasons. In spring and summer, pottage might include fresh greens like nettles or wild herbs, giving it a bright, grassy flavor. Autumn meant root vegetables and sturdy greens like kale, while winter called for whatever could be stored, dried beans, turnips, onions, and maybe some salted or smoked meat. This seasonal flexibility made pottage ideal for a life tied so closely to nature's rhythms. There was no single recipe for pottage because every household made it differently. Some versions were thick enough to stand a spoon in, almost like porridge, while others were thin and brothy, closer to soup. The thickness often depended on how poor or rich the family was at the time. A prosperous week meant more vegetables and maybe a bit of fat for richness, a lean one meant more water and fewer ingredients stretched further than they should have. Pottage wasn't just dinner, it was breakfast and lunch, too. For many families, it was the one meal of the day that everyone shared, usually in the evening after the day's work. Eating was often done from a communal bowl, everyone dipping in with their spoons or even using crusts of bread as scoops. The idea of individual plates and separate dishes came much later. Medieval dining was about sharing, and pottage was perfect for that. And despite its simplicity, pottage had one thing going for it: it could taste different every day. That might sound strange, but imagine using a slightly different combination of vegetables, or adding wild greens one day and a splash of ale the next. Even when the ingredients were basic, small changes in seasoning or cooking time gave the dish variety. In a world where food monotony was common, this subtle flexibility made pottage feel a little less repetitive. Beyond just being food, pottage was also efficient. It cooked slowly over the same fire used to heat the house, so it didn't require extra fuel. The long cooking time helped tenderize tough grains and vegetables, making them easier to digest and maximizing every calorie. This was important for people who needed energy for hard physical labor but didn't have time or resources to prepare elaborate meals. And here's something charming: many medieval families thought of their pottage pot almost like part of the family itself. It was seasoned over years of use, its surface darkened and flavored by countless meals. You could almost tell something about a family by tasting their pottage, the types of vegetables they grew, what herbs they liked, even whether they had access to salt or a small bit of meat now and then. Today, we might see pottage as humble or even boring, but for medieval people, it was comfort food. It was the taste of home, of security, and of using what little you had to make something nourishing. It may not have been pretty, but it was reliable. And in an age when a single bad harvest could mean disaster, having something warm and filling simmering in the hearth every day was as much about peace of mind as it was about food. So while bread may have fueled the medieval world, pottage gave it flavor, quiet, earthy, dependable flavor that kept countless families going, season after season, year after year. While wheat was often considered the ideal grain in the medieval world, the truth is that most people didn't rely on it. In fact, for many communities, wheat was almost a luxury. Instead, their daily lives were sustained by other, hardier grains: barley, oats, and millet. These grains didn't have the reputation of wheat, but they had something far more important: resilience. Barley, for example, could thrive in soils where wheat simply wouldn't grow. It tolerated colder weather and poorer conditions, which made it the perfect crop for regions where farming was more about survival than preference. Oats, too, had their place. Not only were they a staple for humans, but they also fed animals, horses in particular. If a medieval household had a horse to work the land, oats were life for both the farmer and his animal. Millet, though less glamorous than either, grew fast and reliably, making it invaluable when other harvests failed. What's interesting is how people used these grains. Barley, oats, and millet became the foundation for some of the simplest but most filling dishes of the medieval diet. People made porridge from them, thick, hearty meals that might be sweetened with honey on rare occasions or simply eaten plain most of the time. These grains could also be ground into meal for flatbreads, unleavened and dense, yet perfect for soaking up broth or acting as a quick meal on the go. And then there was beer, or more accurately, ale. Barley in particular was central to brewing, and ale was not just a drink but a daily necessity. In an era when water sources were often unsafe or unreliable, ale offered a safer alternative. It was low in alcohol and high in calories, making it both hydration and nutrition wrapped up in one cup. The fermentation process killed off harmful bacteria, and for people who spent their days working under the sun or in damp, cold conditions, ale was more than a luxury, it was essential. These alternative grains also acted as a buffer against hardship. Imagine living in a region where the soil was thin, rocky, or exposed to harsh winds. Wheat simply wouldn't thrive there, but barley or oats could still grow. In years when weather patterns destroyed wheat fields, these hardier grains kept people alive. They didn't offer the refined white loaves enjoyed by the wealthy, but they were reliable, and reliability meant survival. Their importance also extended into culture. In some northern regions, oat porridge or barley bread wasn't just backup food, it was the standard meal. People developed tastes around these grains, adding whatever local ingredients they had to give them variety: herbs for flavor, dried berries for sweetness, or even small bits of animal fat for richness when available. Over time, these dishes became part of a community's identity, as recognizable and comforting as bread baked in a village oven. Working with these grains required skill, too. Barley and oats didn't behave like wheat when baking, often producing flatter, denser breads. Cooks had to adapt their techniques, sometimes steaming or boiling dough instead of baking it, or mixing different grains together to improve texture. That resourcefulness created an entire range of rustic recipes, many of which have echoes in modern traditional dishes. Think of hearty oatcakes from Scotland or barley stews from Scandinavia, they're distant relatives of the meals that sustained medieval farmers centuries ago. Millet, though less documented, played its own quiet role. It was fast-growing and highly adaptable, making it a valuable insurance crop. If the primary fields failed, millet could still produce enough food to prevent starvation. It may not have been glamorous, but in the medieval world, glamour didn't matter, survival did. One of the fascinating things about these grains is how they shaped medieval food systems overall. Because barley, oats, and millet grew in marginal lands, they allowed people to farm in places where wheat couldn't, expanding the boundaries of where medieval communities could thrive. That, in turn, influenced settlement patterns, local economies, and even social structures. A family who relied on barley and oats might live differently than one that grew wheat. Diet, trade, and labor all adapted around what the land could support. It's easy to overlook these humble grains when thinking about medieval food. Wheat gets the attention because it's linked to fine white bread and high status, but barley, oats, and millet were the real workhorses of the medieval pantry. They didn't just fill bellies, they kept entire regions stable when times were tough. Without them, countless families would have gone hungry long before winter ended. So, when you picture a medieval table, don't just see the heavy brown loaves of bread. Imagine also the steaming bowls of oat or barley porridge, the rough flatbreads cooked on simple griddles, and the mugs of frothy ale brewed from hardy barley. These weren't luxuries, they were lifelines, born out of necessity but shaped into tradition. And in their own quiet way, these alternative grains were just as important as any loaf of bread, carrying medieval people through the harshest seasons and the hardest years. While bread, pottage, and hardy grains kept people's bellies full, vegetables and legumes brought essential variety and nutrients to medieval life. Without them, the diet of most common people would have been dangerously one-sided, heavy on starch and lacking key vitamins. Vegetables might not have carried the prestige of meat or the comfort of warm bread, but they were the quiet workhorses of the medieval kitchen, nourishing families through every season. The most common vegetables were simple but reliable: turnips, carrots, and beets. These root crops were essential because they stored well through the winter months when fresh food was scarce. Imagine a family pulling a few dusty turnips from their cellar in the dead of January, chopping them into chunks, and tossing them into the pottage pot that had been simmering since dawn. These vegetables weren't glamorous, but they kept scurvy and hunger at bay when little else was available. Carrots and beets offered more than calories, they provided color and sweetness to an otherwise earthy diet. Medieval carrots weren't always the bright orange ones we know today, they came in purples, yellows, and whites, often smaller and tougher but still dependable. Beets, with their deep red flesh, gave both flavor and vibrancy to stews, and even their greens could be eaten when times were lean. Turnips, though humble, were praised for their ability to withstand frost and grow in soils that weren't ideal for other crops, making them a safety net for many families. Leafy vegetables like cabbage and kale also played a major role. These plants could grow in cooler conditions and, when harvested, could be eaten raw, boiled, or even fermented for long-term storage. Sauerkraut-like dishes, fermented cabbage preserved in brine, were especially valuable because they lasted through the cold months and provided much-needed vitamin C, a lifesaver in an age when fresh fruit was often seasonal and rare. Kale and other tough greens stood up well to harsh weather, making them dependable crops for families living on the edge of poverty and survival. Then there were onions and garlic, which served a dual purpose: flavor and medicine. Medieval diets could be painfully bland, especially for peasants who had limited access to herbs and spices. Onions and garlic transformed simple grains and legumes into something with depth and heat, turning an ordinary pot of beans into a meal worth eating. But beyond taste, these plants were prized for their medicinal qualities. Garlic was believed to fight infections and boost strength, while onions were used for everything from soothing coughs to treating wounds. In a world with limited medical knowledge and even fewer doctors, such plants were as valuable as any tool in a peasant's home. Perhaps the most important part of the vegetable world, however, came from legumes. Peas, broad beans, also known as fava beans, and lentils were crucial sources of protein, particularly during religious fasting periods when meat was forbidden. For roughly 1/3 of the year, depending on local religious customs, people abstained from eating meat, meaning they needed an alternative to maintain energy for farm work. Legumes filled that gap perfectly. Peas were versatile and easy to grow. Fresh green peas could be eaten in summer, but most were dried and stored for winter, rehydrated in soups and stews when nothing fresh was available. Fava beans, though sometimes coarse and bitter, were dependable, thriving in soils too poor for other crops. Lentils, though slightly less common in some regions, provided a soft texture and rich flavor that worked well with pottage and bread. Together, these legumes formed the backbone of many meals, providing vital amino acids and helping people survive on largely plant-based diets for months at a time. Seasonality shaped how these vegetables were used. In spring, tender greens and fresh peas brought brightness after the long winter. Summer meant gardens bursting with leafy vegetables and carrots. Autumn brought root harvests, and winter relied on whatever could be stored or preserved: onions braided and hung to dry, garlic cloves strung together, barrels of fermented cabbage waiting in the corner of the pantry. Nothing was wasted. Even beet greens, pea tendrils, and cabbage cores found their way into the cooking pot. Cooking methods were simple but effective. Vegetables were often boiled together with grains or legumes, seasoned with onions, garlic, and whatever herbs grew nearby. Oil was rare for peasants, so fat from bacon or lard was used when available, but many meals remained entirely plant-based out of necessity rather than choice. Still, these humble ingredients worked together to create meals that were hearty, nutritious, and surprisingly varied throughout the year. And beyond their nutritional value, vegetables and legumes connected people to the land and their local ecosystems. Families knew which wild greens appeared in early spring, which root crops thrived in their particular soil, and how to save seeds for the next season. It was a relationship built on observation and tradition, passed down from one generation to the next. Children learned early how to harvest turnips without damaging the roots, how to braid onions for storage, and how to spot which beans were ready to dry for winter. So while medieval peasants might not have enjoyed the colorful produce aisles we take for granted today, their vegetable-based diet was practical, seasonal, and deeply rooted in survival. These crops provided vitamins and nutrients critical to health, complemented the heavy carbohydrate base of bread and grains, and ensured that even when meat was scarce or banned for religious reasons, there was still enough protein and variety to keep people working, growing, and living. In many ways, vegetables and legumes were unsung heroes of the medieval kitchen, quiet, humble, and indispensable, keeping people nourished through the most unpredictable of times. For most medieval peasants, animal protein was something you hoped for, not something you expected every day. It's easy to imagine a world where meat and cheese filled every table, but the reality was far more modest. Animal products were rare, precious, and often used sparingly, stretched to last as long as possible. Take milk, for example. Not every household had access to it because you needed livestock, cows or goats, to produce it, and owning animals required land, feed, and time to care for them. For families lucky enough to have even one cow or a few goats, milk was a valuable resource. It was rarely drunk fresh the way we might enjoy it today. Instead, people transformed it into butter or cheese, both of which stored better and lasted longer. Cheese became a staple in households fortunate enough to make it, offering a concentrated source of fat and protein in a diet otherwise dominated by grains and vegetables. Butter, meanwhile, was treated almost like gold. A dollop could transform even the simplest pottage or loaf of bread into something special. Eggs were another reliable source of animal protein and a little easier to come by. Chickens were common on small farms because they required less space and offered multiple benefits: eggs, meat, on rare occasions, and even feathers for bedding or trade. Eggs were often eaten boiled or fried when fresh, but medieval people had clever ways to preserve them, like coating them in a lime solution or storing them in brine, which extended their shelf life for weeks or even months. Eggs were especially valued during spring and summer when hens laid most abundantly, helping families vary their diets after long winters of preserved foods. Fish, however, was where medieval diets really got interesting. Thanks to religious fasting rules, which forbade meat consumption on certain days and during long periods like Lent, fish became the go-to protein for much of the population. Salted, dried, or fermented fish allowed communities far from the sea to have access to this essential food source year-round. In Northern Europe, salted herring in particular became a cultural icon. Entire industries developed around catching, preserving, and shipping herring inland, where it would be soaked, cooked, or eaten as is depending on local tradition. Other preserved fish like cod and stockfish filled the same niche, keeping people nourished during times when meat was forbidden or simply unavailable. For those living near rivers, lakes, or the coast, fresh fish provided welcome variety, but even that was often regulated. Many waterways were controlled by local lords or the church, and fishing rights could be restricted, meaning ordinary peasants often relied more on preserved fish bought or bartered than on what they could catch themselves. Still, fish was an essential part of medieval life, and its prominence in the diet was as much about religion as it was about availability. And then there was meat, rare, valuable, and often reserved for special occasions. A pig slaughtered in autumn, for example, might feed a family for months if carefully salted or smoked, and every part of the animal would be used. Wealthier households enjoyed prime cuts, but peasants mostly ate what was left: the offal, hearts, livers, kidneys, heads, feet, and bones that wealthier people sometimes discarded. These parts, while less glamorous, were rich in nutrients and could be turned into flavorful broths, sausages, or pies. Even animal fat, often rendered into lard, was saved and used for cooking throughout the winter months. The scarcity of meat didn't mean people never had it. Festive days, harvest celebrations, weddings, and religious feasts were often marked by a shared meal featuring meat, and it was an event when it happened. A stew simmering with pork, a roasted goose at Christmas, or a small chicken on Easter was more than just food, it was a celebration of abundance, however brief it might be. This reliance on every part of the animal also showed how resourceful medieval people were. Nothing was wasted. Bones became soup bases, hides became leather, and even hooves and heads found their way into stocks or gelatin-like dishes. For peasants, eating meat wasn't about luxury, it was about using every resource as efficiently as possible, making sure nothing went to waste in a world where food shortages were always a possibility. It's worth noting, too, how social class shaped access to animal products. Nobles and wealthy townsfolk ate far more meat and often enjoyed game like venison or rabbit, something peasants were usually forbidden to hunt on pain of punishment. That made the occasional scraps of meat or cheese even more significant for the average family. It was a small taste of something otherwise reserved for people far above them in society. So while today we might take a fridge stocked with milk, butter, eggs, and meat for granted, in the medieval world these items were far from guaranteed. A meal featuring even one of these foods might have felt like a small feast, a welcome break from the daily bread, grains, and pottage. Animal products didn't just feed bodies, they marked moments. An egg at breakfast could be a sign of spring's renewal. A chunk of cheese shared among neighbors might mark goodwill or trade. And a rare piece of meat, no matter how humble, reminded people that even in a hard world, there were moments worth savoring. Even with bread, grains, vegetables, and the occasional bit of animal protein, medieval life still left people hungry at times. That's where nature itself became a kind of silent pantry, offering foods that required no plowing, sowing, or harvesting from cultivated fields. Foraging wasn't a hobby like it is today, it was survival, and medieval people had an intimate knowledge of the plants, herbs, and fungi around them. In spring, when stored food supplies from winter were running dangerously low and new crops were only just sprouting, wild greens became lifesavers. Plants like nettles, dandelion greens, and wild lettuce were among the first to push through the thawing soil, and they were packed with nutrients after months of a starch-heavy diet. Nettles, despite their sting, could be cooked down into a mild, spinach-like green rich in iron and vitamins. Dandelion leaves, now often treated as weeds, were collected for their slightly bitter flavor and health benefits, and wild lettuce offered crisp texture at a time when fresh vegetables from the garden were still weeks away. These wild greens weren't just fillers, they were essential sources of vitamins, particularly vitamin C, which helped prevent scurvy and other deficiencies common after a long winter. The arrival of spring foraging marked not only the change of seasons but also a literal return of vitality to the community, offering fresh energy for the labor of sowing and tending new crops. As the year rolled on, foraging shifted focus. Summer and autumn were times of abundance, and medieval people took full advantage. Woodlands and hedgerows provided berries, blackberries, raspberries, elderberries, and more, each gathered carefully and eaten fresh, dried in the sun, or even turned into fermented beverages. These fruits, high in natural sugars and vitamins, were treasured treats in an otherwise plain diet. Nuts, too, were a valuable find. Chestnuts, walnuts, and hazelnuts were all gathered in quantity during the autumn, often dried or roasted and stored for the winter months. Nuts weren't just snacks, they were calorie-dense, rich in fats and proteins, and versatile enough to be ground into meal for baking or cooking. In years when grain harvests failed or meat was scarce, a sack of chestnuts or walnuts could mean the difference between hunger and health. Mushrooms added yet another dimension to this natural menu, but they came with risks. Medieval people knew well that the wrong mushroom could be deadly, so mushroom gathering required both experience and caution. Families often passed down knowledge about which fungi were safe and which were not, teaching children to recognize subtle differences in color, shape, or habitat. When done safely, mushrooms provided a valuable source of protein and flavor, often dried for storage or cooked fresh in pottages and stews. In some regions, certain mushrooms were even considered delicacies, prized not just for nutrition but for their earthy, umami-rich taste that could transform a simple dish. Foraging also included medicinal plants and herbs, which often blurred the line between food and medicine. Wild garlic, sorrel, plantain leaves, and dozens of other herbs were gathered not only to season meals but to treat ailments. Medieval people didn't have pharmacies as we know them today, but they did have an extraordinary familiarity with what the local landscape could offer in terms of healing. A simple bunch of wild mint might ease digestion, while elderberry syrup was believed to fight off colds and fevers. The act of foraging itself shaped how people interacted with the land. It encouraged observation and care, because taking too much from one area could mean nothing left for the following year. It also required community memory. People needed to know where the best berry thickets were, which groves of walnut trees produced reliably, and which fields could be safely walked after rain. That kind of intimate knowledge often fell to women and children, who had more flexibility to roam and collect while others worked the plows and fields. In lean years, foraging could mean survival on a scale we might find hard to imagine today. A poor grain harvest might leave pantries half empty, and meat was often out of reach. In those times, wild food was not just supplemental, it was essential. People might rely heavily on gathered chestnuts to grind into flour, berries dried and stored as preserves, or nettles boiled daily into soup until the next planting took hold. Even in good years, foraging added variety to an otherwise repetitive diet. A handful of fresh berries in a bowl of porridge, a nut paste mixed into bread dough, or mushrooms sautéed and added to pottage could transform simple, utilitarian food into something flavorful and seasonal. It gave people a sense of connection to the rhythms of the natural world, a reminder that the land offered more than just what was planted and harvested in neat rows. Foraging wasn't without its dangers: poisonous plants, stinging insects, or simply wandering too far into unfamiliar areas, but it was a risk worth taking. The knowledge required to do it safely was considered essential, passed down through generations in the same way people today pass down family recipes. In many ways, foraging represented the ingenuity of medieval life, the ability to survive and even thrive using every available resource, no matter how humble or wild. No story about medieval food is complete without talking about what people drank, because beverages were as much a part of survival as bread or pottage. And when it came to daily drinks, one stood out above all the rest: ale. Ale in the medieval world wasn't the kind of heavy, boozy drink you might imagine today. It was a mild, lightly alcoholic beverage brewed from barley, water, and sometimes herbs for flavor. In fact, its alcohol content was usually low enough that it could be safely consumed throughout the day by adults and children alike. But the key thing about ale was this: it was safer than water. Water in medieval towns and villages often carried serious risks. Streams and wells could easily become contaminated, and people didn't have the same understanding of bacteria and disease that we have now. Drinking untreated water could mean sickness or worse. Ale, on the other hand, was boiled during brewing and went through a fermentation process that killed off harmful microbes, making it a safer and far more reliable option. It also provided something extra: calories. For people burning thousands of calories a day through hard labor, ale wasn't just hydration, it was fuel. A mug of ale might give you a small but steady energy boost, and for peasants who needed every bit of nutrition they could get, that mattered. In a way, ale was like a medieval version of an energy drink, keeping people going from sunrise to sunset. Brewing ale was often done at home, especially in rural areas. Women traditionally handled the brewing, making them essential not only as cooks but as providers of one of the community's safest and most important staples. Each batch had its own character, sometimes sweet, sometimes herbal, depending on what was available. Some households added wild plants like yarrow or mugwort before hops became common in brewing, giving each village or even each family its own signature flavor. Of course, ale wasn't the only thing people drank. Fresh water was still used when available from clean wells or mountain springs, but many people approached it with caution. Herbal teas made from plants like mint and chamomile provided another safe option. These teas weren't just pleasant, they were also seen as medicinal, soothing upset stomachs, calming nerves, or helping people sleep after long days in the fields. A pot of chamomile tea by the fire wasn't just comfort, it was part of medieval folk medicine. In some regions, fruit-based drinks were also popular, particularly in places where apples and pears grew in abundance. Apple cider or perry, a pear-based drink, often took the place of ale, offering a slightly different flavor and nutritional profile but serving the same basic purpose: hydration, calories, and safety. These drinks could be lightly fermented or more potent, depending on local customs and resources, and they gave people another way to preserve fruit harvests for use throughout the year. It's worth noting that most of these beverages were naturally tied to the agricultural cycle. Ale depended on grain harvests, cider on apples, herbal teas on plants gathered during summer, and even clean water on the state of wells and streams. That meant what you drank could change with the seasons. After harvest, for example, ale might be plentiful and freshly brewed. In spring, when old grain supplies ran low, people might rely more on water and herbal teas, using whatever they had until the new crops came in. These drinks also carried social meaning. Sharing ale at the end of the day or pouring cider for guests was more than just quenching thirst, it was an act of hospitality, a sign of community and trust. In taverns and inns, ale became a social glue, bringing travelers and locals together. At home, a pitcher of ale at the table was part of daily life, as ordinary as bread or pottage, and often consumed by every member of the family. And for religious or ceremonial occasions, drinks could take on even greater importance. A wedding feast might feature sweeter, stronger ale saved for the occasion, or cider from the best batch of the year. Herbal teas and fruit drinks might be offered to the sick or the elderly, not just for comfort but because people genuinely believed in their healing properties. So while today we might think of water as our default drink and beer or cider as special, in the medieval world it was often the other way around. Ale was the daily standard, a drink you could trust, and one that also fed you. Herbal teas and fruit ciders offered variety and a touch of flavor, but they all served the same essential function: keeping people safe and strong in a time when even something as simple as a sip of untreated water could be dangerous. For medieval peasants, survival wasn't just about growing food, it was about keeping it edible for as long as possible. A good harvest meant little if it rotted before winter's end, and a failed harvest could spell disaster for entire villages. To survive, people developed clever techniques to stretch their resources and smooth out the unpredictable rhythm of feast and famine. Drying was one of the simplest and most effective methods. In summer and autumn, when fruits, vegetables, and herbs were at their peak, families took advantage of warm, dry weather to preserve food naturally. Apples were sliced thin and hung near hearths, berries were spread on woven mats to dry in the sun, and beans were left on their stalks until they rattled in their pods, ready for long storage. Even fish and meat could be dried, sometimes smoked for added flavor and protection. This kind of preservation required no special tools, just time, knowledge, and the discipline to resist eating the best pieces before winter came. Salting was another powerful tool, especially for meat and fish. Salt itself was precious, often transported long distances and sometimes taxed heavily, but its ability to prevent spoilage made it worth every penny. A barrel of salted pork or a stack of salted herring could feed a family when fresh food was scarce, and preserved fish became a staple protein during religious fasting periods. Salting extended the life of food not just for months but sometimes for years, allowing people to plan beyond the immediate season. Fermentation might have been the most fascinating preservation method of all. People discovered that cabbage submerged in brine transformed into something tangy and long-lasting, sauerkraut before it was called that. Milk could become yogurt or aged into cheeses that kept for months, and even grains could be turned into alesh and beers, which acted as both safe drinks and long-term calorie stores. Fermentation wasn't just a trick for survival, it created entirely new flavors and textures, adding variety to diets that might otherwise become painfully repetitive. These preservation methods reflected something deeper than just food storage, they were part of a whole agricultural philosophy. Medieval peasants practiced what we might now call a closed-loop or sustainable system. Instead of seeing farming as a set of separate tasks, growing crops here, raising animals there, they integrated everything. Manure from livestock enriched fields, which in turn produced the grains and vegetables needed to feed both humans and animals. Crop residues were fed to livestock, while grazing animals helped clear fields and fertilize pastures. This cycle kept soil fertile without modern chemicals, ensuring that land could produce food year after year. It's easy to overlook how sophisticated this approach really was. Medieval farmers didn't have modern scientific knowledge about nitrogen or soil microbes, but they understood, through generations of experience, that diversity and balance were essential. They rotated crops, allowed fields to rest, and grew different plants in different years to prevent exhaustion of the soil. Livestock and crops weren't separate operations, they were two sides of the same survival strategy. This integration made their agricultural system surprisingly resilient. In times of abundance, it allowed people to preserve enough food to withstand leaner seasons. In harder years, when harvests failed or animals died from disease, the same system helped cushion the blow, because people were used to making do with preserved foods and using every available resource efficiently. It wasn't perfect, famine still happened, but it gave people a fighting chance in a world where weather, war, or plague could destroy an entire year's food supply overnight. What's more, these practices made medieval agriculture a kind of niche model of sustainability. Today, we talk about regenerative farming and closed-loop systems as innovative solutions for climate change and food security. But medieval farmers, without intending to be modern or trendy, were already doing many of those things simply because their survival depended on it. Waste was almost non-existent, everything had a purpose, from scraps fed to pigs to manure spread on fields. Even human waste found its way back to the soil in some communities. Preservation techniques also built community resilience. A family with extra dried beans or fermented cabbage might trade with neighbors for honey or eggs, creating local food networks long before the term local food movement ever existed. Knowledge of how to salt a ham or store apples properly was as valuable as owning the livestock or orchard itself, and that knowledge was passed down carefully from one generation to the next. In a sense, medieval people lived closer to the land and more dependent on its cycles than most of us can imagine today. They knew exactly what it meant to rely on summer sunlight to dry their food, to depend on the right amount of salt to keep their winter stores safe, or to trust that their cabbages would still be edible months later because they had been submerged in brine just so. These weren't conveniences, they were lifelines, shaped by centuries of trial, error, and adaptation. So when we picture medieval peasants preparing their food, we shouldn't just imagine them hunched over a pot of pottage or kneading rough bread. We should see them hanging herbs from beams to dry, layering fish in salt barrels, stirring vats of fermenting cabbage, and moving livestock from field to keep the soil alive. This wasn't just cooking or farming, it was a survival system that blended innovation, tradition, and an intimate understanding of nature into something remarkably enduring. If food preservation and farming kept a community alive, the heart of daily life beat right inside the home, at the family hearth. And at the center of that hearth, both literally and symbolically, were the women of the household. In most medieval homes, women carried the responsibility of preparing meals, managing supplies, and passing down the skills that kept families fed generation after generation. Cooking wasn't just a chore, it was a craft, one learned early and refined over a lifetime. Daughters watched their mothers knead bread, taste the pottage, and decide which dried herbs to add for flavor and medicine. Grandmothers shared old techniques for stretching ingredients when times were tight, showing how to thicken soups with barley or how to preserve eggs in brine for lean months. The kitchen wasn't a kitchen in the modern sense. Most medieval homes had one main room, and at its center was the fire, sometimes just an open hearth, sometimes a simple fireplace. Around that fire, meals were cooked, clothes were dried, and families gathered at the end of long days. It was warm, smoky, and full of the smells of daily life, boiling pottage, drying herbs, and sometimes bread baking in a shared village oven down the road. That fire wasn't just for cooking, it was life itself, offering heat, light, and a focal point for family connection. Women learned to make the most of what little they had, often improvising with what the season and the pantry allowed. A handful of greens from foraging. Toss them in the pottage pot. A single egg. It might stretch a loaf of bread or thicken a custard-like dish for a special meal. Nothing went to waste because nothing could afford to be wasted. Knowledge of how to store, stretch, and creatively use every bit of food wasn't written down, it was spoken, shown, and memorized, a living oral tradition as valuable as any crop in the field. Cooking was also social. Children played near the hearth, learning by watching and listening, while women shared tips and recipes with neighbors when visiting or working together. In many villages, communal ovens baked multiple families' bread at once, turning bread-making day into a mini-social event. The act of preparing food connected families not just to their own survival but to the rhythms of community life. The hearth was also the classroom. Kids didn't sit down with books to learn how to manage a household, they learned by doing. Stirring the pot taught patience and timing, grinding grain into flour taught effort and the value of every handful. Even young boys, who would often go on to work the fields, learned basic cooking skills, especially in households where everyone needed to pitch in. In this way, food knowledge was like an heirloom, passed along with the same care as tools or land. A well-seasoned cooking pot might last decades, handed from mother to daughter, seasoned not just with meals but with memory. Recipes weren't recipes as we know them today, they were memories, techniques, and instincts shaped by years of experience. Add enough water until it looks right. Cook it until it smells ready. That kind of wisdom couldn't be taught in a book, it had to be lived. The hearth also carried deep symbolic weight. It was a place of safety and continuity, a space where even in times of hunger or hardship, families came together to share what they had. Meals weren't just about nutrition, they were about connection. A warm fire and a bowl of pottage might seem simple, but they represented stability in an uncertain world. Religious blessings before meals, storytelling while stirring the pot, and songs sung while kneading dough all reinforced the idea that food was part of something larger: family, culture, and survival itself. For women, this responsibility was both empowering and exhausting. They managed food stores, decided how to portion meals so they would last, and kept everyone fed during the hardest times. Their expertise often meant the difference between resilience and hunger for the entire household. Even though their work was often undervalued in the larger social hierarchy, within the family their role as keepers of the hearth gave them an authority rooted in respect and necessity. So when we think of medieval food, we shouldn't just picture fields, markets, or even the ingredients themselves. We should picture that central hearth, the women tending it, and the children learning around it. Because that's where medieval food truly came to life, in homes full of warmth, tradition, and the quiet but powerful knowledge of how to keep a family going one meal at a time. Food in medieval life was never just about filling bellies, it was also a powerful reflection of who you were and where you stood in society. What sat on your plate often told as much about your social status as the clothes on your back or the land you worked. For the vast majority of peasants, food meant survival, not luxury, and that reality shaped everything from daily routines to deep cultural traditions. Bread itself carried a silent message about class. The dark, coarse bread made from rye or maslin, often mixed with whatever filler was available, was the bread of common folk. It was nutritious, yes, but dense and rough, a far cry from the white wheat loaves enjoyed by the wealthy. White bread, carefully milled and soft, was expensive and time-consuming to produce, so it became a symbol of status as much as taste. The nobility and clergy often dined on refined loaves, while peasants ate bread that was hearty, filling, and practical for lives spent in constant labor. Even something as humble as pottage, the thick, bubbling stew made from grains, vegetables, and sometimes beans, spoke to class divides. For peasants, pottage was the foundation of life, eaten day in and day out, its ingredients shifting with the seasons and whatever scraps were on hand. For the upper classes, pottage might still appear, but it was enriched with meat, spices, or sweet ingredients that peasants couldn't dream of affording. It was the same dish in name, but worlds apart in experience. And then there was religion, which influenced food habits as much as economics. Christianity dominated daily life, and the church dictated not just how people prayed but often what they ate. Fasting and abstinence were common practices, with long stretches of the calendar dedicated to avoiding certain foods, particularly meat. Lent, Advent, and numerous fasting days throughout the year created patterns in the diet where fish and legumes became far more important. Fish, in particular, took on special significance. On religious fast days, when meat was forbidden, fish became the go-to protein. Salted herring, stockfish, and other preserved fish filled markets and pantries specifically for these occasions, ensuring that even inland peasants could observe dietary rules. For wealthier households, fresh fish might be transported from rivers or coasts, but for most people, it was the humble salted or dried fish that allowed them to keep faith while keeping fed. Legumes like peas, beans, and lentils also stepped into the spotlight during these fasting periods. They provided protein when meat was off the table and were cheap enough to be staples for even the poorest households. During long stretches of abstinence, people relied heavily on these foods, which could be stored easily and prepared in bulk. Over time, these fasting foods became part of cultural identity. Pottage thick with peas wasn't just a meal, it was a way of life tied directly to the rhythm of the church calendar. The connection between food and religion went beyond fasting. Feasting was equally spiritual, tied to celebrations like Easter, Christmas, or saints' days. These moments offered rare chances for indulgence, often with meat or sweet dishes that stood in sharp contrast to everyday meals. For peasants, a feast day might be one of the few times they tasted pork or chicken all year, turning the meal into a memory as much as a necessity. What's striking is how these religious rules also reinforced social boundaries. Wealthy families could afford a wide variety of fish and fasting-friendly delicacies, sometimes even bending the rules by purchasing expensive substitutes like almond milk in place of dairy. Peasants, meanwhile, followed the rules with the simplest and cheapest options available, which often meant yet another pot of bean-filled pottage or a crust of coarse bread with a bit of salted fish. In a sense, religion equalized people in theory. Everyone had to fast, but in practice, the differences between rich and poor remained clear. Food wasn't just a mirror of society, it was a language of identity. Eating dark bread instead of white, or beans instead of meat, didn't just reflect economic reality, it marked you as part of a specific social world. And observing fasting traditions connected you to something bigger, a shared faith that shaped not just individual lives but entire communities. These rules dictated when to feast, when to fast, and what counted as acceptable nourishment, turning food into an act of devotion as well as survival. Looking back, it's easy to see how food in medieval Europe was more than nutrition. It was culture, status, and faith all served on the same table. From the coarse loaves of the poor to the delicate wheat breads of the rich, from the humble fasting pottage to the rare festival roast, every bite carried meaning far beyond taste. When you look at it from the outside, the medieval diet might seem boring, maybe even bleak. Bread, pottage, vegetables, fish on fast days, and meat only on rare occasions, it doesn't sound like the stuff of culinary dreams. But in its own way, that simple, repetitive diet was balanced enough to keep people working sunup to sundown, season after season. It provided enough calories for heavy labor and enough nutrients, from wild greens to legumes, to keep communities relatively healthy given the hardships they faced. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of choice that we take for granted today. They didn't pick what to eat based on flavor or novelty, they ate what they could grow, gather, or trade for. And yet, that same limitation forced them to create an approach to food that was, in many ways, sustainable by necessity. They understood their environment intimately, when certain plants would grow, which animals could be raised in what conditions, how to rotate crops so fields didn't wear out. That wasn't abstract environmentalism like we talk about today. It was survival. Their preservation methods were equally practical and efficient. Drying, salting, fermenting, these techniques were born out of desperation but also incredible ingenuity. Nothing was wasted because nothing could afford to be wasted. If you slaughtered an animal, you used every part, the meat, the bones for broth, even the hides for clothing or tools. Vegetables past their prime could still be thrown into a pot or fermented for later. Scraps went to pigs or chickens, which in turn provided eggs, meat, or manure to feed back into the cycle of life. That mindset of thrift and resourcefulness carried lessons we often overlook in our modern food system. Today, we waste staggering amounts of food because it's so easy to buy more. But in medieval villages, there was no buying more if you ran out. Every seed mattered. Every loaf mattered. And every decision, from when to harvest to how to store food for winter, had to be made with an eye toward survival months down the line. Even the basic structure of medieval farming offered surprising lessons for sustainability. Instead of specialized, industrial-scale monocultures, peasants worked with diverse, integrated systems. They rotated crops, integrated livestock, and used natural fertilizer long before organic, or regenerative, farming became buzzwords. The system wasn't perfect, famine still happened, and productivity was limited, but it was ecologically balanced in a way that many modern systems are trying to rediscover. Their relationship with food was also deeply seasonal, something we've largely lost. People knew exactly when apples would be ripe, when nettles could be gathered, and when a cow might give less milk because of the winter cold. Food tasted different not because of exotic spices but because it reflected the time and place where it was grown. Eating with the seasons wasn't a foodie trend, it was simply life. That same adaptability extended to their mindset. Medieval people didn't expect variety or abundance, they valued reliability and resilience. A pot of bean stew might be the same meal for days, but it kept families strong enough to plow, sow, and harvest. They accepted fasting periods not just as religious discipline but as a natural rhythm that gave the land, and sometimes their bodies, a break. And when feast days came, with a rare roast or sweet dish, those moments became deeply meaningful, precisely because they stood out from the ordinary. In many ways, medieval eating habits can feel unexpectedly relevant to our world today. Modern conversations about sustainability often focus on reducing waste, eating more plant-based foods, and respecting local ecosystems. These are ideas medieval communities practiced out of necessity, long before climate change or industrial agriculture even existed. Their approach wasn't glamorous or high-tech, but it was rooted in a simple truth: work with the land, respect what it gives you, and waste as little as possible. That's not to say we should romanticize the hardships. Medieval diets could be monotonous, and malnutrition was still common in bad years. But their knowledge, about plants, preservation, and careful resource management, offers inspiration for how we might handle our own food challenges. If people with no modern science, refrigeration, or global trade could feed entire communities year after year, relying only on local knowledge and resourcefulness, what could we do today with everything we know? So, yes, medieval meals might look plain on the surface, but beneath that simplicity was a kind of wisdom. It was a way of eating and living that connected people deeply to their environment, to each other, and to the cycles of nature itself. And while we don't have to return to clay ovens and wooden pottage pots, there's something worth carrying forward: the idea that food isn't just fuel or flavor, it's a relationship, one that works best when it's balanced, respectful, and sustainable. And that's a glimpse into what everyday medieval people actually ate to survive: simple, practical, and surprisingly sustainable. It's a far cry from the royal banquets we see in movies, but maybe there's something we can learn from their resourcefulness even today. If you enjoyed stepping back in time with me, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Thursday Na Storytime, and ring the bell so you won't miss any of our future journeys into history's untold stories. What surprised you most about the medieval diet? Drop your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and until next time, sleep well and dream of history.